Monday, we talked about how we can make progressive change a reality. And tonight, we want to think more deeply about the bigger picture. Can we, as a movement, shift focus from that which we fight and fear towards that which we are building and restoring? Who am I? Whose mellifluous tones are you enjoying right now? Well, I'm Cheryl Conti. I'm so proud to be NETROOTS Nation's first Black board chair. And I'm also the CEO of Do Big Things, a digital agency that is helping leading causes and campaigns to create the new narrative and new tech for the new era in which we all sense we're living today. Our clients have included folks like Earth Day 2020, the 50th anniversary, Supermajority, the Movement for Black Lives, Lauren Underwood, and Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath, who is going up against Moscow Mitch in Kentucky, and with our help has broken just about all the fundraising records for Senate candidates that exist. In support of tonight's theme, my firm, Do Big Things, has partnered with tech startup Swayable in community with the Advancement Project, a member of the Movement for Black Lives, to produce a report that uses cutting-edge tech like AI, and natural language processing to investigate the online conversation and sentiments around terms like defund the police. The results were fascinating. Defund messages have very strong positive responses among those under 35. Naturally, you get it. For older audiences, terms like reimagine are strongly popular at the moment, which actually provides a unique opportunity for the progressive movement to create a broader base and gain traction on the more radically transformative policy changes that many of us believe are needed now. You can get access to this special report starting today and all the data at dobigthings.today. Here at NETROOTS Nation, our long-term goal is to create a progressive movement and a society that is equitable and just for all. To do that, we must dismantle white supremacy and the systems that perpetuate injustice. Peace and prosperity in America is within our reach, but it requires a reimagination of how society serves and protects all citizens, not just some. What does it take to break down systems of oppression that have existed for centuries? What roles can each of us play to support the work of those acting to address societal dysfunction? Tonight, aren't you lucky? You're going to hear from some of the smartest leaders on the front lines of fighting for injustice, plus two superhero champions in Congress who are fighting to dismantle white supremacy and managed to make that fight look very glamorous. But first, you're going to hear from two brave men who are fighting for justice for undocumented people in America. Please welcome Alejandro Fuentes Mena and Zenin Perez.
I'm grateful to share my modus monologue as part of this strategic conversation on dismantling white supremacy and systems that perpetuate injustice. You can listen to mine and other monologues from Modus Theater's Undocu America project tour on our Shoeback Stories podcast. I was just a kid when I realized what being undocumented meant. At age 8, I started going to work with my dad so I could help him rebuild the entire outside of other people's homes, all the while not having a real home of our own. I would help my dad research what to charge and work out all the math. For example, I would discover that for one given job, contractors would charge them $20,000. But my dad had been screwed over so many times that he would only charge $15,000. Clients would see his strength in Spanish, his lack of English and documented status, and give him about $10,000. And that is who my father believed he was. Half the man I thought he was, half the value of any other. I witnessed as my mother would leave for an entire weekend, 72 hours, to take care of someone else's family. She was lured with the promise of being paid over $300 for the weekend, but she would come back with only $100 in her pocket. $100 that she saw as a blessing. $100 that I saw as an attack on our family. All those rich white families saw little value in everything my mom did for them. They would take her away only to use her and spit her out. The money they paid was barely enough for food on the table. It didn't cover the worry my mom had because she couldn't be home to take care of us when we were sick, help us with homework, comfort us when we returned to an empty house. $100 for a whole weekend away from her family, like she was worthless? But don't you understand that she was priceless to me? Well, spending my weekends without my mom, as she cared for other people's children, and spending those weekends working for my dad for free, so he wouldn't lose out any money for the privilege of building a home for someone else's family, and witnessing this over and over and over again, I began to think that maybe I wasn't worth much either. Despite the fact that I had been recognized at school as gifted and talented, despite the fact that I was a math whiz and learned English, a completely unknown language, in less than a year, and that I was an engaged student, despite the fact that I was a precocious worship leader at my church, I let those weekends of feeling worthless affect me. I began making jokes rather than making plans for my future, playing games rather than paying attention, chasing girls rather than chasing my dreams, and like all self-fulfilling prophecies, I got to the point where my grades reflected exactly what society said my parents and I were worth. Half-priced human beings. Luckily, I had a teacher named Ms. Kovacic who worked hard to remind me of my value and helped convince me that what this society was telling me and my family was wrong. With her support and that of many others, I got myself out of that pit of self-deprecation, past the insecurities, past the hate, past the negativity, past that half version of me, and into a good college, into a position where I am now an educator who teaches math. And like my mentors, I teach young children their value because all children are valuable, just as you and I are valuable. As a teacher, I can't help myself. Let me take y'all to school for a few moments. Hope you're good with that. Let's start off with a little math lesson. My father is one man, one of the hardest workers I know. My mother is one woman, one of the strongest and most compassionate individuals in my life. My sister is one daughter, a brat, but a lovable one, and an American citizen. And I am one son, half of this country and half of Chile. And we are four whole, beautiful gifts, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, not the half-priced individuals that society has attempted to make us. Moving to applied math and economics. If this country continues to deport the undocumented community, It is missing out on courageous, strong, intelligent, family-loving, hardworking people of great value. And that is not only our loss. It is your loss to miss out on us. Not to mention the billions in taxes we bring in every year, which, by the way, is billions more than large corporations are paying. Lastly, moving beyond math to ethics. Paying an undocumented person half of their value for their life's work, extracting all you can get to build your homes and take care of your families, and then deporting them as if they had not brought value. It's not just mathematically flawed, it is also an American math story problem gone wrong. It is criminal to treat us as subservient and less desirable. I am living in this country undocumented, teaching your children, supporting them, engaging their minds in math and in their dreams. I'm 100% here, and I'm 100% committed to this country in which I was raised, this country that constantly seeks to spit me out. Lose me, and you lose my value. Not just the money I pay in taxes and money I pay into Social Security that I will never benefit from, but you lose my ability to inspire, connect, and engage. You lose my ability to bring an impact, and you lose the knowledge I bring to my students who are your children. This country would be foolish to lose me. Deport me, but in the end, it's your loss.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. Our loss indeed. Next, I'd love to welcome Zenin Perez.
Hello there. Thank you. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And thank you so much, Alejandro, for your beautiful words. And thank you everyone who's listening here today, as well as thank you everyone who's made Netroots happen this year. You know, as a frequent attender, I was very surprised, but also just heartened to know that so many of us and so many of y'all still gathered this week in the past 3 days, despite all the challenges that our communities are facing. And to me, it just really fills my heart with joy to know that we're all still very activated and we're all very much ready to keep going, because I know that in my heart, you know, we have a big battle ahead of us in the next coming 2-3 months, but I know that this is going to be a long fight and it's going to need each and every one of us. And thank you, Alejandro, for your energy, and thank you, Cheryl, for everything that you bring to the movement, because it's definitely an inspiration for me and for millions of others. As Cheryl said, my name is Zenin Perez. I work for an organization called the Texas Civil Rights Project. And what we do is that we organize in my home state on the front lines with our communities to fight for asylum seekers, to stop the border wall, to ensure that people can cast a ballot this November, and to fight and destroy the carceral system that locks up more Black and brown people in my state than any other state in the country. But this conversation today is really about movements, right? And the long arc that we're fighting here. So I want to talk a little bit about my movement story that really started when I was 2 years old. When I was 2 years old is when my parents crossed the border in Arizona and their journey to a new life and landed in Central Texas, where I grew up. My movement story also started when I was 6 years old, and I realized that I made a grave mistake when I asked my mom for my mom at her restaurant job. And instead of saying the fake name that she used to be able to work, I accidentally said her real name. A 6-year-old boy just asking for his mom almost put her in danger of losing her job and her livelihood and the meager income that she had. My movement story started when I was 12 years old, and when a hyper state of war paranoia in this country, Congress created the Department of Homeland Security. And I saw in real time as the twin arms of xenophobia and imperialism reached out to squeeze the lives out of our communities, out of Muslim communities, out of Black communities, immigrant communities, and others. It also started when I was 17 years old, and I saw my father being arrested and sent to federal prison and subsequently deported a few years later. And it started when in each of those years where he was incarcerated and held in captivity, my family would visit him in West Texas, in a land of private prisons, where each town you drive through and see complexes full of private prisons and entire communities and towns built around to service them. And you would see the heartache of thousands of Black and brown families who would travel to these sites to visit their loved ones. It also started when I was just 26 years old in the summer of 2018, when at my current work, I saw and spoke to the families at the border who were torn apart by federal agents in that cruel summer. I was in the courtroom when a mother who was my age, she was 25 years old, spoke to me in court. And my job was to try to get her name, her information, so that I could try to follow up with her case and try to find her children. And see, when we were speaking to folks in court, we had less than 30 seconds for each individual person. And I needed to get all this information and make sure that they signed a waiver so that I could go and try to find their information. And each time, as I held up the paper and put the pen in their hands that were handcuffed in a federal courtroom in an air-conditioned room in South Texas, their hands would tremble and they would be crying as they tried to sign a document that would allow our team to go and try to find their children who had been taken from them the night before. And it continued just last month, when my team exposed a government Black site in a hotel in McAllen, Texas, where the government is using a CDC order, an order that is meant to stop the coronavirus from spreading, instead is being used to secretly detain, hide, and expel people in the cover of darkness. We found one hotel where dozens of Haitian families inside held up signs for the world to see saying, "Please help us. Please call us. Please know who we are." And when we tried to go in to provide legal assistance, we were violently thrown out by the private guards that our government contracts to help hold people in captivity while they're disappeared in the night. And sadly, we know that even though we exposed this one site just 3 weeks ago, there are thousands more other people in this country right now in hotels, government sites, places where we don't even know. These Black sites where people are being held here in the Rio Grande Valley, but all over the border, who are waiting to be disappeared by this government. Because the ultimate aim of this administration has always been clear: to stop the migration of Black and brown people to this country by any means necessary. In just 4 months of the coronavirus pandemic, the Trump administration has illegally expelled more than 70,000 people from this country. We don't even know who they are. We don't know where they went. There's no paper trail and there is no due process. But even though this struggle has been a part of my life since I can remember, right, both because I was born into it, but because I chose to fight, I know it's not new. We are told and fed the lie that we are a nation of immigrants, but we know this is not true. The very first immigration law in this country was designed to exclude people, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which needed a federal intervention from the top court to even undo. But even before that, right, we know that this fight extends to 1857, when the Supreme Court found that the US Constitution was not meant to include American citizenship for Black people, regardless of whether they were enslaved or free. You see, this fight is about me, but it is about all of us, and it's not about just immigration reform. It's about a fight against the systems that perpetuate the injustices that link our movements. Because make no mistake, our opposition knows how to take the brutal system of incarceration and exclusion that they have perfected, that created and perfected during chattel slavery, and masterfully apply it to anyone it deems unworthy. The same tactics, strategies, and pain are applied across our communities. But I know deep down in my heart that if we come at it with our creativity, our solidarity, and our understanding across each other, across our movements, across our communities, we are going to win this fight. We're going to win in November. But I know that this fight is going to continue past November and probably beyond my lifetime or our lifetimes. But the thing that brings me joy in this moment is knowing that I am with y'all. I'm happy and energized to be in this fight, and I know we're going to win, and I'm excited to fight with y'all. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Alejandro and Zenin. We are deeply grateful for your time sharing your stories, which are painful, yet important to understand so we can bring full humanity to how we welcome the vital contributions of immigrants rather than punish them for the work they do for all of us to build this nation. Immigration is just one of the social justice issues where this community is creating pressure on systems of oppression. Now I'd invite us to shift gears and have a conversation about how racial justice can be a catalyst in challenging corporate power and popular culture. I'd like to welcome one of my dear friends and a seminal leader whom I've long admired, Rashad Robinson of Color of Change and Community Change's Dorian Warren.
Thanks so much, Cheryl, and thanks to NETROOTS for this fantastic virtual convening of all of us. And I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with my dear brother, Rashad. And I just want to jump right in, Rashad, because I've been pondering this speech I saw you give last year, that when it comes to racial justice in big systems like criminal justice or healthcare, you said that we're still in the Underground Railroad phase of the movement. So can you explain what you mean by that? The Underground Railroad phase, not the emancipation phase.
Well, yeah, I mean, why I said it is because I do think that sometimes we think we've won more than we actually have won. We think we are further along than we actually are. Lots of times we are working to diversify racist structures rather than tearing them down. We sometimes think that if we can just get inside of the system, we can make it sort of align to fit what we need. And it doesn't mean that, right, the Underground Railroad is bad when you have it, right? It means that in these moments, you have to work inside of the system, but you can't let that work inside the system make you think that you don't want to tear down that system. And so this actually comes down to this idea at Color of Change of not mistaking presence for power, which I think is very important in this moment as we are on the front pages of the news, as we are trending constantly as a movement, as we are getting shout outs from the stage from all sorts of people that would have never talked about our issues, that we recognize that in so many ways there will be those that come along and work to co-opt our movement. But the thing about presence to power is that when we mistake presence for power, we think that we've done something that we haven't done. We will think that a Black president means that we are post-racial. We will think that a lot of people celebrating Black celebrities means that America loves Black people as much as America loves Black culture. And America can monetize, celebrate, and lift up Black culture and hate Black people at the same time. And those two things don't have to be so in conflict. And so I do think that it's sort of really important is that we have to continue to look at all the industries that shape our lives, from Silicon Valley and Hollywood to all the ways from ExxonMobil to Goldman Sachs to Walmart, all of the ways in which corporations continue to sort of put their hand on the scale. Corporate power anywhere is a threat to racial justice everywhere. And if Wall Street is celebrating this current Democratic ticket, we need to know that that does not necessarily mean good things for Black homeowners. Now, I'm not trying to create false equivalencies between the two tickets. What I am saying is that we have to be conscious of what winning elections and getting inside of elections means for our long-term efforts, and recognize that while we might be trying to win short-term victories, that should not take our eye off the ball around the long-term goals and the long-term winning that we have to put forward.
So I'm always struck when you talk about presence isn't power, because it reminds me of what I just grew up hearing from my grandmother, my mother, my family, and that is Black faces in high places isn't power, right? And we've talked a lot about this notion of, yes, we're a multiracial democracy, but what we don't want to become is a rainbow oligarchy, an oligarchy meaning ruled by the rich few. So why is corporate power still one of the several blind spots in our movement? And what do we need to see differently in this moment to take on corporate power and get off the, get beyond the Underground Railroad to the emancipation phase of the movement?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this actually comes down to power. Power is the ability to change the rules, to create consequences, to force those who make decisions to have to actually sort of consider us, is a way in which we can build a whole movement on Wall Street focused on inequality, but it's not real power. It's simply a conversation. I think the nightmare, right, for me in this racial justice moment is to be a topic of conversation, a T-shirt that people keep in their drawer that reminds them of that moment, that sort of time when they were speaking up and chanting and using hashtags, but not necessarily a movement. I think the single most important measure is our ability to build power and to leverage power and to force institutions to have to do things that they don't want to do. Not simply saying that they're with us, but actually having to do things. And, like you, Dorian, I know we've talked about this a lot. I grew up in a home where Ebony and Essence came once a month. Jet came once a week. We were told this story, right? If we just work hard enough and we get inside of these systems that, every month and every week, they would list the Black folks that had achieved and got inside, the new mayor, the new police chief. If we diversify police forces, if we diversify corporate boards, that in and of itself will lead to sort of a set of change that will be at the level that Black people need. And I think what we have to recognize that these systems diversifying alone do not actually lead towards justice and freedom. In fact, in so many ways, because racism is such a shapeshifter, in some ways it helps to protect those systems. It doesn't mean that we don't do that work. What it means is that we can't do that work at the expense of building and create real progress. I think about this in terms of even our work in criminal justice, right? In all of the ways, we just saw the announcement from the New York Fraternal Order Police, the New York City Fraternal Order Police endorsing Donald Trump. We watched the Cook County Fraternal Order Police march on Kim Foxx, the district attorney elected to move reforms, right? They marched on her, completely their constitutional right, because she had decided that she was going to stop prosecuting low-level offenses. The first Black woman district attorney, they marched with the Proud Boys. They marched with white nationalists. They showed up to her office as reported by the Chicago Sun-Times. They took pictures of the first Black woman district attorney. They rubbed them on their crotches in full view. And then the next day, they put on their uniforms, their badges, and their guns, and they went back into our communities. And so the question here is not a question about hearts and minds. This is a question of power. And power will allow us to get to a place where we can downsize policing, where we can invest in the things that we need to invest in and divest from the things that we want to. But we have to constantly recognize that the only way those police officers get to do it if the major corporations in that city are okay with it. If the only way that the Fraternal Order of Police in New York City can endorse Donald Trump is if their police foundation can continue to get money from major brands and major corporations that also say that Black lives matter. We have to recognize, and this is important for all of us as we work to get rid of Donald Trump, that we have to also defeat Trumpism. And we have to keep our eye on the ball about what is the long-term goal about dismantling the systems and structures that continue to profit from our pain and the incentive structures and the enablers that will allow it to happen.
So there's so much I want to dig into there. And what you raised a whole bunch of questions for us and food for thought. I've, like many of you watching, rewatched the John Lewis documentary recently. And we are still mourning and honoring him. And, as the old saying goes, mourn and then organize. And I was struck, Rashad, by watching some of that footage, particularly of his speech on the March on Washington, and you'll see a Bayard Rustin standing behind him, smoking a cigarette. It's very not politically correct, but cool. and Bayard Rustin is one of those folks that was also focused on corporate power, right? In 1963, he wrote an essay in October after the August March on Washington about questions of corporate power and political economy and the plight of Black workers in particular, and how the civil rights movement needed to solve some of the economic questions and corporate power questions, in addition to the inclusion questions. So I raised John Lewis in particular because we know that he was not just a fighter, he was a winner, right? He fought the good fight, he resisted, but he won some big things. So help us make sense of the challenge now and the strategy of winning massive structural change in our democracy. How should we be thinking about winning strategic campaigns that advance racial justice and take on corporate power at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, you just sort of raised so much from, I think, the sort of role of Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and Ella Baker and so many others who had a deep view of power and people power to push back on a wide range of systems and structures that were hurting us, and recognize King talked about sort of all the ways in which the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act didn't cost America anything economically, and that the next fight would have to be about the sort of billions of dollars to actually deal with the plight that of Black folks, that it didn't matter if you could get to the lunch counter if you couldn't afford to buy a burger once you got there. All of this, I think, is incredibly important because racism is resilient. Like water pouring over the floor, it will find the cracks. And it will find the leaks, and it will constantly leak through because it's so resilient. And the power structures of racism are so resilient. And that's why our movements have to not have sort of short-term visions about what's possible. I think the thing that I think about so much about John Lewis, Congressman Lewis, is how much policy change and rule change happened during that period of time. The Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were sort of force multipliers in terms of legislation. And as a movement, there had to build all sorts of legal and political infrastructure to defend it. And the right built infrastructure on their side, right? They built all of this infrastructure to be able to protect it and to fight against it, to protect their things and to fight against ours. And we built infrastructure to protect it. And all of these things were happening at the same time. And we watched the right, in concert with corporations, work to dismantle things like the Voting Rights Act and take away Section 5, to chip away at equal protections that we had won and gained. But it took them a long time because that's the power of winning rule change, is that your opponents have to consistently chip away. I do think this moment is one of deep culture change, of deep culture shifts to change what's acceptable and push up the ceiling on what's possible. I think about this in terms of our Hollywood work and all of the ways in which we're trying to shift the sort of rules and norms about what's acceptable on TV, how race and racial justice is portrayed. I think about the crime TV shows on TV, and that for the last 20 years, violent crime has went down. But according to Pew Research and others, Americans believe that violent crime is going up. And so this gap between perception and reality creates all sorts of demands for a certain type of policing that allows for people to invest in policing in our communities rather than actually having corporations pay their fair share so that water is clean and schools are funded and parks are there and mental health is available. And so the next phase, the future, right, of how do you hold on to culture change? Because as much as we are trying to win cultural victories, like changing what the public sees as the role of prosecutors and changing what prosecutors see as their job, which is all about narrative power. As much as we are working to change those things, our opponents are working on the other side. So you don't change culture without cultural infrastructure. You don't change culture without being able to reach people through narrative infrastructure. And so for everyone who's watching, we are going to have to work to hold on to the new awakenings that people have as they see that Amy Cooper video in Central Park and maybe see themselves or members of their own family in that video, and recognize that they might want to wake up, but we have to know that that is not, change is not inevitable. And that in order to win, we have to be able to reach people. We have to be able to control the media narrative. We have to be able to, at scale, move our own stories. Because if we can truly win the type of cultural change that shifts what's acceptable and pushes up the ceiling on what's possible, that then will open up the possibility for a new set of policies, a new set of rule change. It means that we have to hold folks like Silicon Valley accountable, who might say they are our friends, but will put their hands on the scale if it means growth and profit. They will ignore security and safety on their platform, ignore the impacts on democracy if it means that they can sort of, their bottom line can increase. We can never, once again, mistake our presence and our visibility for power. We cannot mistake our stories being on the front page of the news for the fact that we have won. That is the importance of infrastructure, and that's beyond any single leader. That is about having organizations and institutions that are ready and willing to engage in the effort of power and using power to shift what is possible and to win the type of justice and freedom that our people deserve.
So Rashad, I know we have 1 minute left, but I want to ask you one last question, because you've talked really brilliantly about the narrative power we need to shift culture. And we've been talking about corporate power, and having gotten my start in the labor movement, I understand the role of disruptive power with strikes and consumer boycotts when necessary. We're in an election cycle, so that gets to electoral power. There's also governing power. What are all the forms of power we need to, in a minute or less, what are all the forms of power we need on the table to really make this moment a transformative moment in terms of racial justice, in terms of our democracy?
Yeah, I mean, we need to be looking at narrative power, cultural power, political power, electoral power. You know, when those levees broke in Katrina, which is about 15 years ago, right about now, and a flood that was caused by bad decision makers that turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. It launched so many different organizations and so much different sort of work. It also illustrated things that people already knew: geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, and the ways that structural racism undergirds all of those things. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. Government, corporations, and media. And so at every turn, as we work to build power, I want us to make sure that we are not just thinking about, do people care about us? Are they empathetic? But are they nervous about disappointing us? Because empathy gets us charitable solutions to structural power. Power gets us structural change. And that is actually what we have to win. And so as I sit here and think about the 400 years of Black people on this land, as I think about the indignities and the exploitations of Indigenous and Native people, we can never expect people to simply care about us if they are not willing to act in concert. And that has to be the standard by which we think about power, and that has to be the standard by which we fight for change.
With that, that'll be the last word for this section. Thank you, Brother Rashad, for inviting me to be in conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Dorian. Love you, brother.
Love you very much. And I'll toss it back to our greatest host of all time, Cheryl Conti.
Dorian, Rashad, you took my breath away. Thank you so much to both of you for bringing your energy and your ideas and your vision to this space. Fortunately for us, your presence is power. That was electric. And I love the inspirational idea of shifting what's possible. And whether we're coming together to reimagine a new vision for community safety, an end to abusive ICE policies, or Indigenous land sovereignty, our struggles are interconnected. Next up, we have two incredible leaders coming forward to speak in depth about how each of us has a role to play in building the world we want to see, one that's equitable and safe for everyone. Please welcome Nick Tilson of NDN Collective and Alicia Garza of Black Futures Lab and the co-founder of Black Lives Matter.
Thanks for having us on. Haumadakiapi, Nick Tilson, Amachiapi, Trantea Washtena Petuzapalo. Get to greet you in my Lakota language, warm, heartfelt handshake, language my people fought, died, and sacrificed for, that we carry on today. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank NETROOTS for having us for having us on here to talk about some important issues. You know, in the current historical moment that we are in this nation, as we fight for social justice and racial equity in this nation, we cannot forget Indigenous people, and Indigenous people have to be a part of helping create this future. And we are locked and ready to be contributing for this actual future that we're fighting for. You know, if you look back at the history of Indigenous resistance, the American Indian movement was started on the streets of Minneapolis. It was started on Franklin Avenue, and it was started policing the police for unjust, over excessive force of use of the police force against Indigenous people, just blocks and blocks away from where the murder of George Floyd happened. And if you look throughout the history of our people, there is a direct correlation between the oppression of Black and Indigenous people in this country. And therefore, so much of our collective liberation is actually bound up with one another. And I think that's the thing that excites me about this actual moment in history that we're in. You know, I've been a lifelong activist, fighting, you know, in my home community on Pine Ridge to improve the quality of life. You know, you look at where Indian country is at and where Indigenous communities are at today. You know, you look at the lowest, you look at the social determinants of health, and you look at the lowest, most places of poverty in the nation. And if you look at the places where economic mobility for children is the lowest, you will always find Black and Indigenous folks. And I think that there's been sort of like this history for a race to the bottom, when we actually should be leaning in with each other around collective liberation for a race to the top. But the top needs to be something that looks just and equitable for all people. And so I think that, you know, in this historic moment, there's a lot of power that we can call upon our ancestors that have come before us. You know, there's a history of the American Indian movement and the Black Panther Party working together. And I think that we're in a moment where we can build on some of that history. And I agree with the things that were said here today. We actually have to be talking about power, not just representation, power. And that's what we built the Indian Collective for. Our work here at the Indian Collective is about building the collective power of Indigenous peoples to exercise our inherent right to self-determination while fostering a world built on a foundation of justice and equity for all people on the planet. And that means we have to see a fundamental shift in power and in the way that even the way that our movements are resourced. You know, right now here today, philanthropy spends less than 0.5% of all their resources on Indigenous people into Indigenous communities. And that has been the statistic that is true all throughout my whole organizing career, right, which is my entire adult life. And so we created the Indian Collective to make sure that our movements and to change the conditions of the way in which our movements are actually resourced. And so we're building one of the biggest philanthropic funds in the history of philanthropy, led 100% by Indigenous people for Indigenous people, because white supremacy and racial injustice is alive and well in the field of philanthropy. And it's also the part of philanthropy that's actually trying to move our causes forward. But armchair philanthropy, so far away from the problems that exist in this country, only perpetuates the problem. It doesn't actually solve it. And so, you know, we all know this saying that, you know, we got to get resources closer to the pain and closer to the problem so that they're connected to the people who have lived experience in doing this work. And that's what the Indian Collective is all about. You know, we have a foundation that we're building so that we can move those resources and actually liberate dollars from these institutions, and not only dollars, but liberate decision-making power back into the hands of our communities and our people. And we're doing that both in philanthropy, we're doing that in organizing, we're doing that in narrative building. And so it's not just that we have access, it's about who has decision-making power over that access. And so when we think about those things, those are the things that are really important to us. And right now, you know, we are in the process of building this land back movement. And to us, this land back movement and this land back campaign that we are building, it's a framework, right? It's a framework for us as Indigenous people, what we think reparations look like. It's a framework to not just get the stolen land of Indigenous people back to Indigenous people, but to tear down the systems of white supremacy and oppression that have been created for the stealing of our land. Because you can connect all of the social determinants of health, the economic problems that we're faced with, all of those challenges directly to the stealing of our lands and the oppression of our communities and our people. And I think that there's a moment right now in history to onboard around collective liberation as we dismantle white supremacy in this nation.
That was amazing, Nick. And I can't wait to get into conversation with you. I want to offer a couple of words that I think are certainly in line with what you're offering here in terms of having us think about not only what time it is now, but what are the vehicles that we are building to ultimately get to where it is that we need to be. And so I want to just start this conversation off by saying that in a recent meeting, I asked my team, what does it look like in this moment to leave it all on the field? If we are going to not just challenge power, but also transform it, what does the work look like right now where we can say, we gave it absolutely everything we had? And here we are. I'm not going to tell you anything you all don't know. We're in the midst of a global pandemic where Black communities are under attack from a lack of response. And of course, there's no recovery in sight. We're at the beginning of a deepening economic recession and a sharpening climate emergency. And then, of course, to top it all off, we're in the midst of what I think is the most important election cycle in a generation. And democracy is being dismantled before our eyes. In this context, what does it mean to leave it all in the field? Well, first, I think it means keeping our eyes on the prize. So, next week at the Democratic National Committee convention, there's going to be a nomination made for who will challenge this president. There's a platform that is going to be announced that is outlining the issues and the values that supposedly organize this party for the next 4 years. And for so many of us who work in politics, these processes are important in certain contexts and for certain reasons. But I can't help but hold with me that there are millions of people who don't work in politics every day, who don't attend conferences like these and don't even know that they exist, millions of people who are trying to figure out how to make a way out of what increasingly becomes no way. And for millions, right, the stimulus check is long gone. For millions, politics has failed to deliver on its promises. And for millions, this is not the kind of change that they believe in. So it makes me realize that what it means to leave it all on the field in this moment, in this context, is our movements. Movements that have developed and have arisen from a desire to see and experience justice and fairness and wellness in our lifetime. And our movements are needed now more than ever, because when this president loses and refuses to cede power, we're going to depend on these movements to get us to the other side. And it is only these movements that can provide that compass for us. I think our primary work right now is twofold. The first is to deliver the kind of mandate unlike any that we have seen in at least a decade, that we will no longer capitulate to white nationalism as an organizing principle for how we be together in this country. It's white nationalism that is shaping this political moment, and it's shaping our responses to deep-seated wedges in this nation. I think this mandate that we express will initially be expressed through voting, but ultimately it has to be expressed by reshaping the structures that keep millions of people out who actually need to be at the center of the governing process. And so that's our other key task. It's to continue to push to change and to reshape and reimagine the structures that have kept so many of us left out and left behind. I think we can no longer afford to pay lip service to racial justice, especially in the era of white nationalism, if we hope to reach any semblance of a terrain that we can actually fight on. In an era of white nationalism, we have to understand it's no longer enough to symbolically build movements that ensure representation, but don't actually do the work to weave our lives together in such a way that makes power have new meaning. I think elections are a way for us to test how we've been doing with our organizing, and they're an opportunity for us to choose the terrain that we want to fight on. Our opponents have made themselves less nebulous, and their agenda is more clearly in focus. They are moving power in ways that kick people out of their homes in the midst of a pandemic. They're moving power in ways that deny people access to the healthcare that we need in the midst of a pandemic. They're shrinking the role of government so that democracy can't survive, because in their view, it's been too tainted with the movement that we're building to ensure the rights and dignity of those that they don't consider to even be human. So I think we've got to be clear that this moment, it's about voting, but it's more about showing the power of our movements. It's about picking a clear target and shifting how power operates. And fundamentally, it's about driving white nationalism back underground and putting it in the history books and in museums where it belongs. So let's chat, Nick. We got things to talk about.
Yeah, I think one of the most exciting things, and this is something I'd like to hear your opinion on too, is, white supremacy and systematic racism is designed to actually divide movements of people of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And sometimes because we are so struggling for survival, that we end up being like on these different tracks and different trajectories of what we think power should look like. And sometimes we fall into that. We fall into those structures, maybe not because we're intentionally trying to do that, but because actually the system that we are fighting is drawing us further apart than bringing us closer together. And, I've been really thinking about this balance of like, what is Black reparations and Indigenous land back look like? And how can we actually build a world that includes both of those things? Because that's definitely a world I want to raise my family up in and my grandkids up in one day when I have them. So I was going to see what your thoughts were on that a little bit, and how we lean into that to make these actual structural shifts.
Absolutely. Well, what's funny, Nick, is I was going to ask you the same question. So we're going to have to go back and forth here. But fundamentally, I think that this is a question of how it is that we not only reclaim and reshape power, but it's also a question of how it is that we tell each other different stories about each other. I think that at the core of reparations, right, you're absolutely right. Earlier you said, it's not just about, right, land back. It's also about restructuring how it is that we be together. And I think the first part of kind of bringing these reparations frameworks together is fundamentally about changing the stories that we tell each other about each other that actually are not our stories, right? So there is something in here for me about, what it looks like to have deeper discussions, right, about the legacy of slavery as a vehicle to consolidate and direct power in a particular direction. I think it makes sense for us to be talking about the unique roles that each of our communities have played, and the ways in which we've been played in the project, right, to build this country as a foundation for us to start to think about, well, in a different setup, right? What would be the fundamental principles that would undergird our unity, right? And where are the sticky points too? So just to be super clear in there, I think in a capitalist country, right, where everything can be bought or sold, and everything is for profit, right, and not for people, there's a worldview, right, that also has to be shifted as a part of shifting our relationships. And so many of us, right, are used to a framework, right, where we understand land, right, as a thing that you own, that you can buy and you can sell, as opposed to a thing that is your birthright, or a thing that needs to be cared for, or a thing that cares for us, right? And so I just wonder if part of the undergirding to a project like that is really about unseating, right, how it is that we understand the value, right, of building these kinds of new structures and new ways of being organized together. How about you, Nick? What do you think?
I mean, I think it's about shifting power, you know. I mean, excuse me. I think it's about shifting power. I mean, Rashad said something. Well, excuse me.
This happens to me all the time. Take your time. So it's definitely about power. And you're going to take a sip of water.
Sorry about that.
You got this.
At the end of the day, to me, it's like we have to do the work that our ancestors want us to do. Our ancestors want liberation for our people.
That's right.
Our ancestors want our connection to our land and to nature and to each other to be restored. This is spiritual work. This is powerful work. And I think that our movements play a fundamental role. I mean, elections are elections, but just like movements, our organizations are tools for change, but movements are made up of people.
That's right.
We all have these handles, right? NDN Collective, Black Futures Lab, all these different organizations. But at the end of the day, they're merely tools for liberation. And I think that what we say when our brothers and sisters aren't in the room is so important. Yeah. You know, what we say about the leadership as Indigenous people of the movement for Black lives and Black liberation, when those leaders aren't in the room to our own communities, is important, vice versa. So that's like a fundamental way that we can shift culture and real unity, because then you create intention truly with one another. I think that when you think about the decision-making structures, that's why to us, you know, you look at what it would mean to have land back to Indigenous people, that all of a sudden the conversation about corporate pipelines that are coming through our territory, or, you know, nuclear waste storage on our lands, or some corporate farm coming up to exploit our communities and our people, or what they're doing with the KXL pipeline or the Dakota Access Pipeline or Line 3 or any of these pipelines, that conversation fundamentally changes because we have gotten our land back and we're in the decision-making seat of our own communities and of our own future.
That's right.
And I think that is the shift that we need to really begin to see.
I agree with you. And I'm wondering, Nick, too, if you deal with this as well, which is, or let me phrase this differently. Do you think that our movements, I mean, we talk a lot about power, the need to build it, the need to wield it. Do you think that we're afraid of power? And if so, why? And if not, what do you think gets in our way to building the kind of power that we need in order to change our conditions?
I mean, I think, wow, that's a deep one there. I'm thinking about that one. I do think that we are afraid of power. I think that we're not afraid of power, we're afraid of change. And I think that in the process of oppression and colonization, they have beaten us down in our minds and our spirit. And that's why our movements aren't just about achieving victory, right? We're all like, especially those of us who are like seasoned organizers, right? You got to win. What's the win look like? Checkbox. Win, 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 win. You know, but reality is our movements are part of that healing journey, are part of the radical transformation for our future. And the movements that we're building, they're part of the energy and the spiritual energy that will actually shift from this place of burn it down to build it back up. With being it clear that burning it down is a fundamental part of us being able to even get there. And that in the same breath that we have to be building it back up. But it's not just that we do it, it's how we do it. And I think that's why the movements are part of that, is about this growth. And, you know, the land back action that I had the opportunity to be a part of on my own lands in the sacred Hesapa, when we protested 45 rolling into the lands of the Osheti Shakoi, you know, we were like, you know, our political analysis of that particular situation was, this president just went to Tulsa around Juneteenth, and now he's going to come into the heart of the Osheti Shakoi of our lands around the time of Independence Day, to a mountain that was carved by a member of the Ku Klux Klan on land that was stolen. Even land that the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1980 said that was stolen, and we had to do something. And the fact that we were standing there on our own lands and experienced, you know, the wrath of the military force of this country, of having a couple hundred indigenous people standing on their own lands that the Constitution, or that the Supreme Court even said was our own lands, and the fact that now in this moment, you know, we are facing huge amounts of charges. I mean, right now, myself, I'm facing up to 15 years in prison for the activism that I took there. And along with my 20 other land defenders are also facing charges. Yet the people on that mountain were slave owners. They're mass murderers. They did the largest execution of indigenous people, or the largest mass hanging in the history of the country, when Abraham Lincoln, you know, ordered the hanging of 38 Dakotas after the Dakota Uprising. And these are the ironies. And that's not unique. You look all across the whole country. You think about how many people that are both leaders and not leaders of all of these movements that are facing time right now for the rebellion that is now taking place. That cannot continue, because all of us that are in those places are assets to not only the movement that we're building now, we're assets to the future.
That's right. I mean, I'll just close by saying that, you know, what is powerful about what you just said, Nick, is that it underscores that our fight right now is not Biden versus Trump. It's fascism versus democracy. And frankly, you know, the fact that you could be facing 15 years in federal prison for protecting land is ludicrous, and it's asinine. And what is real, right, is that I am not being facetious when I say this president doesn't plan to go nowhere. We're going to have to push him out. And the reason why, right, is because what you are facing and what so many other activists here are facing as well, in terms of, excuse my pun, trumped up charges, and really being targeted for trying to make change. What we're facing is that if we do not deliver this mandate in November, those conditions will get sharper. So we've got to be very, very clear what we're up against, so that you and I and so many others get to actually do the work of building the new society and the new democracy that we so desperately deserve. I really appreciate you, Nick. Thank you for spending time with me today.
Absolutely. It's an honor to be on here. And just a quick plug, we are launching a national campaign. You can find out more about the campaign at landback.org. Indigenous, this movement that we're building the Landback campaign will be a mechanism to tear down white supremacy and build an avenue to create collective liberation between Black, Brown, Indigenous folks all throughout this country. So we look forward to doing all that work with each and every one of you out there. So
I can't wait to check it out. Thank you, Nick.
All right.
Thank you to NETROOTS.
Absolutely. Thanks, NETROOTS.
Thank you. Wow, wasn't that spine tingling? Our ancestors do want liberation for all of us working as one. I feel that in my spirit. And let's not be afraid to use our power to create that better world we can see just over the horizon. Thank you, Alicia and Nick, for those visionary and futuristic remarks. Our last two speakers barely need introduction. They are founding members of the Squad and the women who keep MAGA up at night. Let's hear from two champions in Congress who not only reflect the diversity and soul of our nation, but who are tirelessly fighting for every person in this country. Let's give a big welcome, and it's okay to clap from home, Representative Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts and Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. And I'm actually wearing one of my favorite buttons today that says "Our squad is big," because it is certainly bigger than 4 members of Congress. The squad is anyone doing the work of building a more equitable and just world. And I thank all of you for being foot soldiers in that movement and doing that work. I wish that we could be together physically, but it's in the interest of public health. We have to continue to distance, but we can't allow our efforts to wane. Our organizing to be obstructed or slowed in any way, especially now. I'm so humbled to virtually be able to join you in community and to be among these exceptional group of activists, advocates, and community builders that you've had a chance to hear from the past 3 nights, so many of whom I'm lucky to call colleagues and accomplices in the pursuit of justice and partners in good. I stalled for a moment in starting to speak there because I'm so full. There have been so many words this evening. And so I just want to say I associate myself with all the comments that have already been said this evening. But together we are really tackling an enormous question, a question which lies at the center of our shared experience. What does it take to break through generations of institutional oppression, systemic racism, white supremacy to advance true justice for our communities? Now, it certainly requires an acknowledgement of the challenges that we face. Today, our communities are facing overlapping crises of public health, economic inequality, and systemic racism. We know that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are dying at disproportionately higher rates from COVID-19, or what Pastor Warnock in Georgia refers to as COVID-19, making plain the barriers to healthcare that have endangered our lives for centuries. And of course, the only thing this virus couldn't kill is racism. And we are so devastatingly reminded by the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and so many others. My heart breaks at the profound hurt being inflicted on our communities, but it also swells because I know that this moment of unprecedented hurt demands and requires of us unprecedented organizing, unprecedented mobilizing, and unprecedented hope. Earlier today, I was at a convening with some colleagues at Local Progress. And one of my brothers in arms there was offering that, despair is clear, but hope is more opaque. And so that's why this moment we find ourselves in of what does this reimagining, this re-envisioning, this reconstructing, what does it really look like? Because hope is more opaque. But these are unprecedented times and we are experiencing unprecedented hurt. And that does demand of us unprecedented organizing, unprecedented mobilizing, and unprecedented hope. So my heart breaks that we have to keep coming together to demand that people affirm and see our humanity, but it swells that we keep coming together. Activists, advocates, agitators, organizers, table shakers, disruptors, creatives. So many of them, young, Black, brown men and women who have taken to the streets and the halls of power to demand justice. The community organizers who are leading this movement, they are not destroyers. They are community builders who are carrying forward the best traditions of the civil rights movement. And no, this is not a second civil rights movement. This national reckoning on racial justice, we have been in it the whole time. So this is not a second movement. We have been in it the entire time. Let us be clear. The injustice plaguing our communities is not naturally occurring. It has been created and exacerbated by generations of bigoted policies which have codified racism, exclusion, and bigotry. Now, growing up in Chicago, my mother and I lived in the residual aftershocks and aftermath of redlining and the failed war on drugs. And those are the same challenges which persist today. So this is why I say policy is my love language, because if the hate, hurt, and harm afflicting our communities disproportionately has been legislated, that does mean that we can legislate healing and justice too. We can pass policies and budgets that actually value Black and brown lives. And if it feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar to some, it is because we have never done it before. Again, hope is opaque. So how do you build something when you don't really have a stabilizing reference? We are our own analog in this moment. And that is as liberating as it can be paralytic. But still, we do have some notes that we can refer to, and we need to buckle up because, listen, my mother let me know early on. She did not patronize me as a child and read me, fairy tales for bedtime stories. She read me the speeches of Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm, and my coloring book was the Black Liberation Flag. And she made sure that I knew that as beautiful and as prideful as I should be about being Black, that I was being born into a struggle. And that was a cradle to grave struggle. And it was her expectation that I would be active in that struggle. So buckle up, because if you look at what are the founders of the other founders of our democracy, who have not been given equal foothold in our history books, but if you look to them, the movement in the 1950s and 1960s and about the scale and scope of our activism at that time. Let me just give you some numbers here. The Greensboro sit-ins were 6 months. The Freedom Rides were 7 months. The Montgomery bus boycott was 382 days. So when Rashad says that we're in the Underground Railroad phase, he's right. We are just getting started. And as we fight for a culture shift in this country, and we've all been echoing this, we must also fight for a power shift. In the past few months, we have witnessed important electoral wins across the country, from Jamal Bowen in New York to Cori Bush in Missouri. Again, the squad is big, y'all. Electing more leaders like Jamal and Cori is important, not only because they better reflect the communities they represent, but because they are fiercely committed to fighting for the policies that will usher in real sustainable change. It is so rare, y'all, that you are creating history and acutely aware of it. Right now, we are writing the next chapter of the civil rights movement. This is about a paradigm shift, but we can't stop at the streets and the ballot boxes. We have to bring that same energy and determination to legislating, because that was the real blueprint for the movement: organize, mobilize, legislate. And so that's the work that I've been doing in deep partnership with folks in my 2 years in Congress. And I won't enumerate all of that. I'll just say that it's been wonderful to work in partnership with a coalition of lawmakers, organizations, and advocates in the fight to end qualified immunity, to hold law enforcement accountable, to dismantle racist systems of policing in this country, to ensure an equitable recovery, both in our public health and economic response. And in the past several months, as we talk about this culture shift, and Rashad mentioned how people are with greater efficacy and fluency saying Black Lives Matter. But if we really value Black lives, then we need to back that up with meaningful action. And that means that you are unapologetically affirming that, yes, we need to cancel student debt, because Black students borrow in default more than anyone else because of laws that obstructed our ability to build generational wealth. That is a racial justice issue. So Black students matter, that Black business entrepreneurship matters, that Black creatives matter, that Black home ownership matters. Black artists matter, Black data matters, Black research matters, right? So in short, thank you for your Black Lives Matter post. Now show me your budget. The only receipts that we care about in this moment are law change and budget change. I was just revisiting how the top 100 public US companies all put out statements for Black Lives Matter, and they don't have one Black person serving on their board. So we have an opportunity to legislate our values, to continue pushing for policy that actually codify equity and justice for the folks in our communities. But it will take collective advocacy. It will take us being intentional. It will take our being inclusive. It will take collective organizing and collective power, because as has been said, Alicia was speaking to this, we don't just organize for elections. Although we want to celebrate those victories, including of my sister Ilhan. Folks like to think that this is a wave, anomalies, a fluke. This isn't Black girl magic. This is Black woman work. And my colleague has been putting that in. So I just want to acknowledge that. But we don't just organize for elections. We organize to build community. We organize to build power. And then we need to flex it. Now, Dr. King said change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. I hope I'm bringing this full circle here, because as my mother told me I was born into, and that was her expectation, that I would do my part in that struggle. And so how do we dismantle systems of oppression? How do we advance the work of equity and justice? We organize for it, we advocate for it, and we legislate for it together. So grateful to be your sister in solidarity in this work. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to join you in virtual community. And I'll see you on the front lines. Okay.
Well, thank you, my sister in service, Presley. You're not just Black girl magic, but you truly are the actual example of what Black girl work is. And I am just so honored not to only share this virtual stage with you, but to get the opportunity to work with you every single day. So thank you. Ayanna was right about something. She said that the civil rights era isn't one that is over, right? Isn't one that we are seeing the second phase of. It's a continuation of that. What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger? That was the question Martin Luther King asked 60 years ago after the now iconic Greensboro sit-in. The point was not to minimize the importance of ending legal segregation, but to illustrate that in the struggle, economic justice and racial justice are not merely fighting to tear down systems of oppression in the criminal justice system. We are fighting to tear down systems of oppression that exist in housing, in education, in healthcare, in employment, and in the very air we breathe. Because in America today, white families have 42 times more wealth than Black families. When we say housing is a human right and we need to guarantee homes for all, we are speaking to the fact that home ownership rates are nearly twice as high for white families as they are for Black families. And here in Minnesota, it's triple. And people of color are more likely to face eviction and homelessness. When we introduce legislation like the Zero Waste Act or a Green New Deal, it is because we know that environmental racism is very real for our communities. Whether it is living near incinerators in North Minneapolis, a proximity to power plants and factories, higher exposure to emissions from pollution, the disproportionate harm that disasters like Hurricane Katrina cause to Black communities, or even access to basic things like clean water, we are bearing the burden of environmental catastrophe. When we say healthcare is a human right and that every American deserves free healthcare, we are speaking to the fact that Black people are 50% more likely to be uninsured than white people in this country. And as Ayanna always says, when America gets a cold, Black Americans get pneumonia. Our communities are the ones bearing the burden of the coronavirus more than any other. People of color make up disproportionate share of low-wage essential workers who have had to keep working in food processing plants, grocery stores, and other workplaces, despite risk to their health. We are also facing higher rates of joblessness related to COVID-19 crisis, while also suffering racialized police brutality and militarization. And the mortality rate for Black Americans with the coronavirus is twice as high as it is with other races. This for me is very personal. I lost my own father to the coronavirus, and I see the pain and the havoc it's wreaking on the Black immigrant community here in Minneapolis. The crisis we are seeing right now is the result of decades of social and economic neglect. Our communities are desperately crying out for change and rejecting the status quo, because the status quo has failed them for decades and continues to fail them, even as Americans die by the tens of thousands. Our response to this neglect cannot be written with the same playbook that got us here in the first place. We must recognize that these systems of oppression are linked. We can't have a world where we care about working people and not build a social fabric that lifts up all working people. And as Ayana says, we can't say Black Lives Matter without having those words be legislated. And recognizing that requires sacrifice, shared sacrifice. So yes, we have to reimagine what public safety should look like, not just here in Minneapolis, but across the country. And yes, we need to invest in reparations to right a historical wrong. But we also need to embed policies within the system to make it more equitable. A Green New Deal is a racial equity policy. Medicare for all is a racial equity policy. Homes for all is a racial equity policy. Canceling student debt is a racial equity policy. And in closing, we have to be clear that our destinies are linked together. That my destiny, your destiny, and the destiny of everyone across the world is interlinked. So creating a path to peace in our foreign policy is a racial equity policy. And when we build systems that recognize the inherent value and dignity of every single human being, only then will the words Black Lives Matter truly be a reflection of our institutions. It is a great honor to have the opportunity to be in community with you all, to have the privilege and the honor of not only organizing with you, to be in the streets with you, but to be part of a group of lawmakers who are legislating with you. Thank you all so much for having me, and I look forward to the days that we can have these conversations in person. So thank you.
Wow. Representative Presley, Representative Omar, many thanks for inviting us all to become members of the squad. And let's make it as big as possible so we can truly dismantle white supremacy and the systems of oppression that keep us from the full realization of the American dream. It's been an honor to have Representative Presley, Representative Omar, and all of tonight's speakers inspire us toward a brighter reimagination of America's future. Let's bring new meaning to the words indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. On behalf of the NETROOTS Nation boards and staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us. I am so grateful for all you, listening right there at home, are doing to help your family, friends, and neighbors during this difficult time. While we may indeed be in a cradle-to-grave struggle on this Underground Railroad, I know that better days are coming, and that's because of you. Our destinies are connected indeed. Let's act on that and act like it. Good night and Godspeed.